Water. Just water. That's all it took to ignite a chain reaction I never saw coming. I was hunched over my laptop at the small kitchen table in our Scottsdale condo, sifting through spreadsheets for my clients at Prescott Accounting. My favorite mug, half full of lukewarm coffee, steamed quietly beside me. Then came the sound, a splash, a clatter, and Derek, my 32-year-old son, standing there with wide eyes, his hand dripping wet. "My bad, Mom," he shouted, but the damage was done. The laptop flickered, stuttered, and died. Months of client reports, tax prep, and personal budgets, gone. And just like that, I felt my misbelief unravel. Keeping the peace with Derek was no longer safer than setting firm boundaries. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I stared at him, the water dripping down the edge of the table, pooling on the tiled floor. His grin tried to soften the blow, but it only made my blood pressure spike. Was this clumsiness? Or carelessness on a level I'd ignored for decades? I'd always let him skate by, thinking conflict was worse than confrontation. Big mistake. He backed away, pretending it was an accident, but my mind raced. Derek had always needed to be reminded about responsibility. Car insurance payments, rent contributions, even the mortgage on this condo. It was a juggling act I'd managed alone. Yet here he was, threatening months of work with one careless move. And then it hit me. If I didn't act now, the consequences would ripple beyond this laptop. His life savings, which I'd been monitoring quietly, could vanish just as easily if he wasn't taught boundaries. I took a deep breath, feeling the AC hum, the sunlight slicing through the blinds, and the faint aroma of reheated coffee. It was my turning point. The rules had to change. Derek wasn't malicious, he wasn't, but charm didn't absolve financial recklessness. And that's when I realized, I could fix this legally, ethically, and firmly. I could turn a spilled cup of water into a lesson he wouldn't forget. But first, I had to trace every document, every account, every tiny slip in his financial management. I had to prepare. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. I sank into the kitchen chair, rubbing my temples while Derek hovered nervously near the fridge, fidgeting with the water-stained corner of a grocery receipt he'd left on the counter. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, blending with the distant hum of traffic on Scottsdale Road. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, a rhythm fueled by frustration and a twinge of guilt. I'd always thought avoiding conflict was the safer path. Keep the peace, smile through mistakes, and life would flow smoothly. But now, faced with a ruined laptop and a son who couldn't seem to grasp consequences, that misbelief felt fragile, almost foolish. The smell of reheated coffee mingled with a faint scent of citrus from the dishwasher detergent. I thought about all the small, everyday compromises I'd made for Derek. Forgiving him for late rent contributions. Covering for missed deadlines at his temp job. Letting him borrow my car without a formal schedule. Each act of grace had chipped away at the boundaries I should have had. And somehow, I'd convinced myself this was love in action. I sipped the cold coffee, grimacing. The bitter taste was fitting, reminding me of months of unnoticed carelessness and overlooked responsibility. My mind wandered back to the past few years, the mortgage payments on my Scottsdale condo, which I'd refinanced twice to cover both Derek and my own client obligations, the yearly HOA fees I'd paid on time, despite Derek shrugging off his portion, the gym memberships, grocery runs, and the unending parade of little emergencies that had become my norm. Each act of indulgence, each silent nod to his negligence, had trained him to expect leniency. But the laptop incident wasn't just about electronics. It was symbolic, a dam breaking. All the small compromises, the subtle financial rescues, the endless "it's okay, Mom" moments, they'd piled up. And I'd been blind. I shook my head, trying to focus. My accountant's brain kicked in. Numbers. Ledgers. Accounts. I visualized the flow of Derek's savings, the regular deposits from his temp jobs, the occasional bonus from freelance gigs, and the hidden debts he'd quietly accumulated. If I acted carefully, legally, I could create a chain of consequences that would teach him responsibility without breaking the law, or our relationship entirely. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint street sounds beyond the blinds, the rumble of a light rail train, a dog barking 2 blocks over, the scrape of tires on asphalt. Normal life. Ordinary. And yet, in this moment, it felt like the calm before a storm. I also felt the twinge of fear that often accompanies taking action against someone you love. Could I really step in and put boundaries that might feel punitive? Could I enforce consequences while remaining ethical, staying within the law, and protecting myself? I'd always hesitated, thinking it might damage our bond. But in truth, enabling Derek's carelessness had already been doing that. I glanced at the kitchen table where the water had pooled, now drying into faint rings on the laminate. It was a small stain, but symbolic. The ripple effect of a single careless act. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't act, those ripples would turn into waves. If that sounds harsh, here's the truth. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They are clarity. They are protection. They are preparation. And as much as I hated the idea of turning my son's mistake into a lesson with teeth, I knew it was necessary. But the truth didn't start that night. It started months earlier. Months before the infamous laptop incident, life in our Scottsdale condo had felt like a tightrope walk. I'd moved here after taking early retirement from my firm in Phoenix, hoping to downsize and simplify. Instead, I ended up managing 2 households under one roof, mine and Derek's, though managing often felt more like micromanaging a whirlwind. Derek had just turned 32, and he was bright, no doubt about it, but he lacked follow-through. I remembered a Friday afternoon in March, standing in the crowded Fry's Electronics, watching him debate which external hard drive to buy. "Mom, the 2 terabytes is better, but the 1 terabyte is cheaper," he said, grinning like it was a life-altering decision. I sighed and bought the 2 terabytes for him, my accountant's instincts screaming about budgets and long-term planning. Yet I rationalized it. I wanted him to feel capable, independent, trusted. Then there was the infamous HOA drama. Our condo association had strict rules about pet ownership. Derek had brought home a foster cat without filing the required paperwork. I spent 2 hours on the phone with the HOA, tracking down forms, emails, and fax confirmations, all while Derek lounged on the sofa, oblivious to the fine looming over him. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. Boundaries mattered, and he had none. Healthcare bills added another layer of stress. Derek had a minor surgery in July. I'd handled the insurance claims, medical bills, and follow-up appointments while he bounced between jobs. Each hospital form became a mini-battle, a negotiation of responsibility that I silently lost again and again. By summer, my own accounts showed the strain, overdraft fees, late payments, and creeping anxiety that made my mornings feel heavier than they should. One quiet Saturday, I found myself flipping through a stack of old bank statements. Derek had accumulated a modest savings account, about $12,000, but I noticed something alarming. A few withdrawals were undocumented. Some payments seemed out of sync with his freelance income. My accountant brain lit up with red flags. Yet when I mentioned it casually, Derek laughed it off. "Relax, Mom. It's fine." That had been my cue to stay silent, but a tiny seed of worry planted itself in my chest. Objects that would later become pivotal littered the condo. The email printout of Derek's first bank statement showing an unexplained $1,200 withdrawal, the lease clause from the condo association that prohibited subleasing or late fee exemptions, and a small receipt for a laptop repair he'd forgotten to mention. Each item seemed innocuous, but in hindsight, they were breadcrumbs leading me to the moment when I realized legal, ethical boundaries were the only tool I had left. Social expectations weighed on me too. My book club in Old Town Scottsdale often discussed family, finance, and success, and I couldn't escape the subtle judgments. "He's a bright boy, he'll get it together," a friend once said over chai lattes, her eyes sympathetic but unknowingly dismissive. I smiled, nodded, and went home thinking, yes, but will he? And more importantly, will I ever stop cleaning up his messes? Even Derek's few positive traits, his charm, quick wit, and occasional acts of genuine thoughtfulness, complicated things. People liked him, trusted him, and sometimes, so did I. But charm without accountability had a cost, and that cost was growing. My condo, my finances, my sanity, everything was on the line. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. I'd realized that my default, avoiding confrontation, letting him skate by, wasn't helping anyone. Boundaries weren't just rules, they were lessons. They were protection. They were leverage. And it wasn't just about the laptop anymore. It was about ensuring Derek finally understood responsibility, the the consequences of carelessness, and the importance of transparency. The stage was set. All that remained was to map it legally, ethically, and strategically. Every document I'd tucked away, every bank statement I'd analyzed, every interaction I'd allowed to slip by would become a tool. The calm, sunny Scottsdale mornings belied the storm brewing inside our condo. But by summer's end, I knew, one way or another, that storm would teach a lesson Derek couldn't ignore. I knew I had to act, and act cleanly. No screaming matches, no ultimatums. Legal, ethical, precise. That was the only way Derek would learn without destroying our relationship entirely. I cleared a space on the kitchen table, laying out 3 piles: bank statements, condo documents, and Derek's freelance invoices. Each piece of paper was a small weapon in a battle I was determined to win lawfully. First, I scheduled a meeting with our local branch manager at Desert Horizon Bank. I explained that I needed to set up formal controls on Derek's accounts for his own protection. I wasn't freezing his funds arbitrarily. I framed it as a responsible oversight plan, ensuring bills were paid and that any sudden large withdrawals would be flagged. The banker, a cheerful woman named Vanessa, nodded and typed rapidly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "We can set up alerts, authorization requirements, and a small claims notice if necessary," she said. I felt the first flicker of control. Next, I revisited the condo association documents. The CC&RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, were strict. Late fees, HOA fines, and unauthorized guests could trigger immediate financial penalties. I highlighted the clauses, making notes in the margins. If Derek failed to follow the rules, the association itself could act as a wild card in my plan. It wasn't vindictive, it was leverage. I also drafted a formal, concise contract for Derek, laying out clear expectations, timely bill payments, notification of account changes, and accountability for any property damage. I knew he would push back, but this wasn't about punishment. It was about establishing boundaries. I used precise language, citing dates, amounts, and obligations. It felt almost surreal, me, the mother who had avoided conflict for decades, suddenly orchestrating a legal safety net that Derek couldn't ignore. To create urgency, I set a timer. The next HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. The bank needed account authorizations finalized by the end of the month, and Derek's freelance contract had a mid-month bonus tied to accurate invoicing. If he didn't comply, the consequences would hit automatically. The stakes were clear: his savings, his reputation with the HOA, and even his professional credibility were all on the line. I thought about allies. Vanessa at the bank could enforce the account flags. The HOA board could send notices if rules were violated. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, an eagle-eyed retired paralegal, could subtly remind me to double-check my filings. Each ally had limits. They wouldn't act for me, but they could amplify the consequences if Derek ignored the boundaries. And then there was Derek's charm, the biggest complication. He could charm friends, co-workers, and even strangers into thinking he was a victim. I had to anticipate it. I documented everything: receipts, emails, invoices, and notices. Every interaction became a paper trail. No room for ambiguity, no chance for him to wiggle out with a smile and shrug. That first night, I laid out the full plan: account alerts, lien preparation, HOA monitoring, and the contract I would present. It was meticulous, precise, and completely legal. I felt a strange thrill, like a chess player setting up the perfect sequence of moves. Derek thought he was walking into another harmless Friday. I was about to turn a spilled cup of water into a lesson he would never forget. I poured a glass of water and set it on the table, a symbolic gesture, almost taunting the universe. This time, the water wouldn't be the disaster, it would be the wake-up call. Then the pushback started. Derek wandered into the kitchen, sniffing the air like a predator sensing change. "What are you doing, Mom?" he asked casually, but his eyes flicked to the table, to the organized piles, to the contract with my neat handwriting. "Planning," I said simply. No anger, no tremor. Just calm, deliberate planning. "And this time, you're part of it." He laughed, but it was different from his usual charm. Uneasy. Curious. I could see him calculating, trying to gauge how serious I was. He didn't know yet that every step, from the bank to the HOA to the contracts, was a net closing around him. I watched him leave the kitchen, thinking, Yes, the setup is solid. Yes, the promise is clear. And yes, for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand, without breaking the law, without being cruel, and without losing myself in anger. The next 2 weeks were a delicate balancing act. I'd set the wheels in motion, but life has a funny way of testing the neatest plans. First, Derek discovered the contract I'd left casually on the counter. "What's this?" he asked, feigning ignorance as he flipped through it. I didn't flinch. "Expectations. Boundaries. Accountability," I said calmly, watching him squirm under the weight of clarity. He tried charm, pleading, and even subtle guilt-tripping, but I'd built my arsenal legally. Every clause referenced specific obligations, dates, and dollar amounts. My misbelief of avoiding conflict would no longer protect him, or me. Then came the bank complication. A misfiled form meant the alerts weren't active yet. I spent an entire afternoon on hold, navigating the automated maze of Desert Horizon Bank. "We see the request," the representative said. But it wasn't processed correctly. My stomach twisted. One delay could unravel weeks of preparation. I resent the forms via certified mail, double-checking every line. By the time the sun dipped below the Scottsdale skyline, I felt like I'd run a marathon on adrenaline alone. Social pressure added another layer. My book club friend, always sympathetic toward Derek, texted, "He seems stressed. Maybe lay off a little." I clenched my jaw. Laying off would undo months of preparation. I reminded myself, boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. I typed a neutral, polite response and closed my phone. No discussion, no debate. Meanwhile, the HOA delivered an unexpected mini-blow. They sent a warning notice to Derek for a minor infraction he hadn't reported, leaving a bicycle in the common hallway. Technically, he'd violated the CC&RS. The wild card had emerged, ready to enforce consequences I hadn't even prompted. Derek's charm with neighbors had no effect here. HOA rules are impartial. And then the mini reveal that shifted everything. I found an old email from Derek to a friend, mentioning a hidden $2,500 debt he'd quietly racked up from a failed freelance project. It explained the mysterious withdrawals I'd seen months earlier and confirmed my suspicion. His financial recklessness extended beyond mere forgetfulness. This wasn't just about spilled water anymore. It was about accountability, protection, and long-term consequences. Each complication added pressure, but I had to stay precise. One misstep, one emotional flare, and the entire plan could backfire. I kept a daily ledger, noting forms submitted, HOA notices, account alerts, and Derek's reactions. Everything had to be documented. By the end of the second week, tension between us was palpable. Derek tried small gestures, making coffee, offering to run errands, but the gestures were empty. I nodded politely, acknowledging the effort, but the boundary stood firm. My principle was simple: consistency beats charm every time. I could feel my resolve hardening. The stakes weren't just money, they were lessons, maturity, and responsibility. If Derek couldn't respect boundaries now, he'd face much greater consequences later. And the ripple effect of each complication reminded me why this plan had to be meticulous, lawful, and unwavering. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. It wasn't just Derek's carelessness or charm. It was the absence of a system that could enforce accountability without me turning into a tyrant. The missing link wasn't punishment. It was structure, transparency, and lawful leverage. Once I reframed the goal, I could upgrade the plan, strengthen the boundaries, and ensure the lesson would land, without fear, without guilt, and without breaking the rules. By the third week, I realized that my initial goal, simply to protect my laptop, my sanity, and a few $1,000s, was too narrow. Derek's carelessness wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a mindset, and if I wanted to create lasting change, I needed to reframe the problem. This wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching accountability, legally and ethically, and making sure he couldn't sidestep it. I started by voicing a boundary out loud. That Sunday, while Derek scrolled aimlessly on the couch, I held up the contract and said, "Derek, here's the plan. These aren't suggestions. They're expectations. If you can't meet them, there will be consequences, not because I'm cruel, but because you need to learn responsibility." He blinked, startled. His charm usually softened these moments, But this time, my calm authority cut through. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then muttered, "Fine, I'll read it." That pause, that hesitation, it was a tiny victory. I could see the first sparks of comprehension. Next, I refined the plan. The bank forms? Checked and confirmed. Alerts now live. Any withdrawal above $500 would trigger a notification directly to me. The HOA? I'd compiled a simple checklist of infractions, fines, and procedures. Derek couldn't charm his way out of that system. It was impartial and documented. I also scheduled a small meeting with Vanessa, the banker. Together, we reviewed the account, confirming the alerts, authorizations, and the framework for potential small claims action if he violated the agreement. Vanessa smiled reassuringly. This is a solid plan. It's fair, protective, and enforceable. Her words gave me a surge of confidence. The reframing extended beyond logistics. I began consciously separating my emotions from the actions. I wasn't angry, I was precise. I wasn't punishing, I was enforcing clear rules. That mindset shift transformed my approach. Derek's spilled water became symbolic. It was the catalyst, not the target. I also introduced the first public stance moment. At a family dinner with my brother and his kids, I casually mentioned the importance of financial boundaries. "I've started keeping a closer eye on responsibilities," I said, noting Derek's surprised glance. I didn't accuse, I simply stated. My tone implied authority without aggression. Public acknowledgement reinforced the rules. Derek couldn't claim ignorance later. Finally, I internalized a simple mantra: follow the rules, every single one. Every legal document, every bank form, every HOA clause was now a piece of a structure I could enforce. No emotion-driven reactions, no delayed consequences. Precision was my tool, and legality was my armor. That weekend, I watched Derek carefully. He tried small tests, asking for an early withdrawal, forgetting to submit an invoice, and even attempting a friendly negotiation about the contract clauses. Each time, I calmly referenced the rules, the forms, and the deadlines. No debate, no compromise. He recoiled slightly, realizing the rules weren't flexible. So I stopped asking for permission and started following the rules, every single one. The reframed goal shifted from short-term protection to long-term accountability. The stakes had broadened, not just my laptop, not just my sanity, but Derek's understanding of responsibility, transparency, and consequence. For the first time in months, I felt the momentum swing in my favor. I wasn't chasing anger or resentment. I was orchestrating a lawful, ethical system that would teach him a lesson he couldn't charm his way out of. The midpoint had arrived. Clarity replaced chaos, structure replaced fear, and precision replaced enabling. The next 2 weeks became a flurry of precise, lawful actions. Every step was documented, timed, and cross-checked against my ledger. I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. I was executing a strategy that left no room for ambiguity. First, the bank alerts went live. Any withdrawal over $500 triggered a direct email and text to me. Vanessa at Desert Horizon confirmed it in writing, providing timestamps and reference numbers. I even set a small daily summary report to monitor Derek's spending. Every dollar he moved now left a digital footprint he couldn't erase or ignore. Next, I formalized the contract I'd drafted. I printed it on high-quality paper, attached copies of the relevant bank statements and HOA clauses, and scheduled a sit-down with Derek. I explained calmly, "This isn't punishment. It's protection, for you, for me, and for your future. These are expectations. If they are not met, the consequences are automatic, and everything is documented." Derek tried his usual charm offensive, leaning back, grinning, and waving a hand. "Mom, come on. You're overreacting." I smiled, poured a glass of water, and left it untouched on the counter, my symbolic reminder of what started this. Not overreacting. Planning. You decide how responsible you want to be. I left him with a copy, not a conversation. I also leveraged the HOA wild card. I sent a neutral email to the board, highlighting minor infractions Derek had committed, the bicycle in the hallway and the shared space clutter. I didn't ask for fines, I asked them to confirm the documented rules in writing. Their reply was precise and impartial. Yes, these are violations, and yes, the penalties are enforceable. Derek's charm had no effect here. Then came the small claims preparation. I drafted notices citing the exact clauses in the bank agreement and contract. Every form referenced specific dates, amounts, and obligations. I filed one minor claim preemptively, not as a punishment but as a legal signal that boundaries had teeth. The system was now self-enforcing. Each day, I maintained a careful record of Derek's reactions. He tried minor tests, borrowing my car without notice, skipping invoice submissions, and even asking for early withdrawals. Each time, I referenced the documents, the bank alerts, or the HOA rules. Calm, factual, and consistent. He realized quickly that charm no longer worked, and that every action was accountable. By the end of the week, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. The laptop disaster was no longer a loose thread. It had become the trigger for a full, lawful, structured lesson. My ledger reconciled perfectly. Dates, forms, notifications, and responses aligned. No ambiguity. No unfair advantage. Just boundaries that were clear, enforceable, and above all, ethical. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. At first, it felt like everything was working perfectly. Derek submitted invoices on time, responded to account alerts promptly, and even picked up his bike from the hallway without prompting. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief, thinking the lesson had landed. My system of boundaries, documentation, and lawful leverage seemed flawless. But life rarely follows a straight line. The first crack appeared when Derek's freelance client unexpectedly delayed payment. That bonus I had counted on to reinforce the contract's expectations never arrived. Derek panicked, and my neat system suddenly faced a test it hadn't fully anticipated: financial pressure outside my control. I had accounted for his mistakes, but not for external ones. Then, a surprise text from Vanessa, the banker. One of the alerts didn't process correctly yesterday. Sorry for the delay. My stomach sank. 2 minor glitches, but enough to give Derek room to argue. He grinned slyly, sensing weakness. See? You're overreacting again, he said casually, waving his hand. Next, the HOA complicated things further. A board member, unfamiliar with my exact request, misfiled my inquiry, and Derek managed to charm a sympathetic neighbor to vouch for him. Suddenly, I was facing a minor setback, a potential delay in the enforcement of penalties that had been integral to my plan. Emotionally, I felt the first real wave of doubt. Months of preparation, careful documentation, and precise timing, was it enough? Derek wasn't malicious, he was just unpredictable. His charm and improvisation were formidable, and despite my legal and ethical safeguards, I realized the plan's success wasn't guaranteed. The mini backfire reached its peak when Derek submitted an invoice late, citing the delayed client payment, and claimed I had no authority to enforce the contract retroactively. My meticulous documentation kept me calm, but the emotional impact was jarring. I felt frustration bubbling, the urge to snap or lecture him. That was exactly the trap I couldn't fall into. For a moment, I wondered if all my planning had been for nothing. My ledger was perfect. The contracts were enforceable. The alerts were live. And yet, in practice, human unpredictability was testing every assumption. I had an apparent victory, but the cracks were widening, and I had to act carefully to regain control without crossing ethical lines. Until one line in an old message changed everything. I had almost forgotten an email Derek sent 6 months prior, where he had admitted, almost flippantly, that he had mismanaged part of his savings but had intended to cover it later. The text confirmed that he wasn't careless because he was irresponsible. He was careless because he had no structured accountability system. This wasn't defiance, it was confusion. Misalignment of intent and follow-through. It was the key to everything. The minor backfires weren't failures, they were signals. The system I had built wasn't broken, it just needed adjustment to address real-world unpredictability. If I recalibrated, enforced timing more precisely, and kept my calm, I could turn the apparent backfire into a teaching moment. I realized the lesson wasn't over, and the final reveal, the true motivator for Derek's carelessness, was buried in the past. Understanding it would allow me to recalibrate, strengthen the boundaries, and finally achieve the ethical, lawful outcome I had envisioned. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sorting through old emails, preparing a summary for the bank and the HOA, when I stumbled across a thread I hadn't seen in months. Derek had written to a former mentor, confessing something I hadn't realized. He'd been covering a secret loan he took to bail out a friend's business. The $2,500 he had quietly withdrawn months earlier wasn't frivolous. It was an act of misplaced loyalty. Suddenly, everything clicked. The scattered withdrawals, the late invoices, the panicked excuses, they weren't pure irresponsibility. Derek cared about others more than he cared about his own system of accountability. But because he lacked a structure, that care had become chaotic and destructive. His intentions were good, his execution, disastrous. I traced back to the objects I'd planted mentally as checkpoints. The old bank statement with the $1,200 unexplained withdrawal, the laptop repair receipt, the HOA lease clause, and the contract I drafted. Each of them now told a story I hadn't fully understood before. They weren't just warnings or triggers. They were signposts showing where Derek's chaos intersected with my responsibility. I realized that the spilled water incident, the laptop disaster, wasn't just carelessness. It was the physical manifestation of a system gone unmonitored, of good intentions unmanaged. My initial frustration, though justified, had been aimed at the wrong target. Derek wasn't careless because he was lazy. He was careless because he had no framework to channel his intentions responsibly. This revelation didn't soften my resolve, it sharpened it. Now I knew precisely where to stand. My role wasn't to punish, it was to enforce accountability and teach sustainable responsibility. The legal and ethical mechanisms I'd set up, the bank alerts, the contract, the HOA oversight, weren't tools of vengeance anymore. They were scaffolding for Derek to stand on, not traps to fall into. I pulled the email thread into a folder and highlighted key lines. One sentence struck me: I want to do the right thing, but I'm always juggling too many promises at once. That was the real problem. The missed deadlines, the late withdrawals, the chaos. It wasn't malevolence or laziness, it was systemic overload. I could see now that every minor complication, every apparent backfire, had been a signal to refine the plan. The bank alert glitch, the delayed HOA enforcement, even Derek's late invoice, they weren't failures, they were data points. They told me where the system needed reinforcement, where timing had to be more precise, and where Derek needed a nudge without embarrassment or fear. This major reveal reshaped my strategy. I wouldn't need to impose harsher consequences or escalate publicly. Instead, I would continue following the rules, methodically, ethically, but with full knowledge of the real motives behind Derek's actions. My leverage wasn't punishment, it was clarity. And clarity, when combined with lawful enforcement, would teach the lesson he needed to learn. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet sense of balance. Derek's flaws were human, understandable, and addressable. My role was clear: guide, enforce, and document, all within the bounds of legality and ethical responsibility. The spilled water, the financial chaos, the backfires, they were all stepping stones toward the outcome I had designed. Now, the stage was set for the final phase. With understanding, precision, and ethical leverage, I could transform months of frustration into a lawful, clean, and cathartic resolution. I knew exactly where to stand, and this time, nothing would distract me from the goal: ensuring Derek's accountability, protecting my assets, and finally closing the loop on the spilled water that had started it all. The morning I finally executed the final step, I felt a mixture of adrenaline and calm. Months of planning, documentation, and legal maneuvering had led to this moment. It wasn't about anger anymore, it was about closure, accountability, and seeing the structure take hold. I started with the bank. I reviewed the alerts one last time, double-checked that any withdrawal over $500 would ping my email immediately, and confirmed that Derek could no longer bypass notifications. I printed a summary of all alerts, forms, and signed authorizations, and sent him a neutral email: all systems are now live. Any withdrawals outside of agreed limits will be documented and enforced per our contract. Derek, predictably, tried a quick charm offensive. He leaned into the doorway of my office, grinning. "Mom, you really went all out, huh?" I didn't laugh. I didn't scold. I handed him a copy of the updated ledger and contract. "It's all live. You know the rules. You know the consequences. This isn't punishment, it's accountability. Your choices now determine the outcomes. Then came the HOA. I sent a concise, polite follow-up email, confirming their enforcement policies and referencing the minor infractions. I didn't ask for fines, but I clarified that future violations would be documented and that Derek would be responsible for resolution. The HOA responded promptly, a clear, impartial acknowledgement of rules and enforcement. Derek's previous attempts to charm his way around minor offenses had no effect. Finally, I addressed Derek's freelance obligations. I printed the invoices, highlighted deadlines, and noted prior late submissions with the corresponding financial impact. I sat down with him and calmly explained, "Your savings and income depend on accurate, timely submissions. Missed deadlines have consequences, legally and financially. You now have the structure to avoid mistakes, but the responsibility is yours." He looked at me, eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw genuine comprehension. The mix of precision, documentation, and impartial enforcement had stripped away excuses. His usual deflection tactics, the charm, the casual shrug, were powerless against the clear, lawful scaffolding I'd built. Over the next week, I watched as the system worked flawlessly. Derek submitted invoices on time. Any withdrawals triggered alerts, and he learned to plan around them. The HOA infractions were resolved properly, and the ledger remained current. The spilled water that had seemed like a minor incident became a symbol of a lesson learned. Emotionally, it was surreal. I felt a surge of quiet triumph not from punishment, but from control, clarity, and lawful consequence. I hadn't yelled, argued, or forced him. I had simply created an environment where responsibility was unavoidable. And Derek, despite his flaws, responded. There were moments of tension, of course. Derek would sometimes frown at a bank alert or sigh at a reminder about an HOA rule. But I never wavered. Calm, lawful enforcement replaced drama. Adrenaline faded into steady satisfaction. Each time he complied, the lesson solidified. I realized the revenge I sought wasn't personal, it was structured, legal, and cathartic. Then came the calls. Vanessa from the bank called to confirm that all alerts were functioning perfectly. The HOA emailed their final acknowledgement, noting that Derek was now fully compliant. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, sent a cheerful text, "Seems like your system actually works. Good for both of you." These external confirmations reinforced that the plan had succeeded without resorting to cruelty or shortcuts. And Derek himself, the human target of months of preparation, came to me quietly one evening. "Mom, I get it now. I really do. I've been reckless, and all of this, helped me see where I needed boundaries." I didn't smile smugly. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded. "That's the point. You have the framework now. Use it." The laptop was safe. My finances were intact. Derek had learned the lesson he needed, through structure, clarity, and lawful consequences, not drama. The spilled water had triggered the chain, but the result was far larger. A system of responsibility, accountability, and mutual respect that would hold for years. I poured myself a glass of water that evening, just as I had on the first day of planning. But this time, I didn't leave it as a symbol of chaos or a reminder of past frustration. I drank it calmly, savoring the sense of closure. The water, the spilled laptop, the chaos, they were all behind us. The lesson had landed, the boundaries were enforced, and the cathartic resolution was complete. In the days following the execution of the plan, life began to settle into a surprisingly calm rhythm. Derek adjusted quickly. No tantrums, no evasion. He submitted his freelance invoices promptly, checked the bank alerts, and even started maintaining a small spreadsheet to track his own savings. The structure I had put in place wasn't just effective, it was transformative. Friends and family began to notice the change, too. My brother called to comment on how Derek seemed more responsible during their Sunday dinner. "He's different," he said. "Like he actually thinks before he acts." I didn't take credit outright, I simply nodded. Boundaries had done the work, not lectures or nagging. Financially, the situation stabilized. The alerts and contract ensured there were no more unexpected withdrawals, and the HOA confirmed that all minor infractions were properly documented and resolved. Derek's credit remained intact, his obligations transparent, and our household dynamics significantly improved. Even Derek himself seemed to internalize the lesson. One evening, he said, almost casually, "I actually like having the rules. I know where I stand now." That sentence, simple as it was, carried months of friction, frustration, and legal maneuvering behind it. It was the quiet victory I hadn't expected, the intangible, yet essential, measure of success. Yet, the fallout wasn't entirely predictable. A neighbor, who had been skeptical of my approach, expressed concern that I was too controlling. I smiled politely, knowing they hadn't seen the full context. The truth was simple. The system had worked because it was fair, legal, and transparent. No one had been punished arbitrarily. The consequences were the natural result of choices made within clearly defined boundaries. By the end of the week, the household had a new equilibrium. Derek was responsible, the finances were secure, and I had regained a sense of calm authority. The spilled water, the laptop repair, and all the months of preparation had culminated in a lawful, ethical, and lasting resolution. And just when I thought it was settled, just as I was beginning to relax, a subtle ripple reminded me that life rarely allows complete closure. One Thursday evening, Derek approached me holding an envelope with a sheepish smile. "Mom, I found something," he said, handing it over. Inside was a small check, $200, labeled as a repayment for a minor expense I hadn't even remembered. At first, I thought it was just an odd gesture. But then he explained, while reorganizing his finances, he realized that a few small debts from months prior had gone unrecorded, creating minor discrepancies in his account. He'd quietly corrected them without prompting. It wasn't required under the contract or bank alerts. It was self-initiated accountability. This was the first twist. The real growth wasn't about my enforcement. It was about Derek internalizing responsibility. He had absorbed the lesson beyond the legal scaffolding. The system had been necessary, but the true change had come from him. Then came the double twist. A week later, I received a phone call from Vanessa at the bank. There had been a glitch in the alert system, a delay that had lasted 2 days. Normally, it would have allowed a withdrawal to slip through unnoticed. But Derek had caught it himself, paused the transaction, and notified me immediately. He didn't need the rules to prevent mistakes anymore. He had started self-monitoring, anticipating the boundaries I'd established, and acting responsibly even when the system wasn't enforcing it. It was a quiet revelation, yet profound. My meticulous planning, documentation, and lawful leverage had worked, but the ultimate outcome wasn't my doing alone. Derek had grown into responsibility organically, choosing to uphold accountability even when enforcement wasn't immediate. What I learned wasn't about him. It was about me. I had believed my only tool was control and legal scaffolding. But clarity, patience, and structured boundaries had created an environment where growth was possible. The twist was that the system didn't just enforce consequences, it cultivated conscience. By the end of that week, I realized that the spilled water incident, the months of contracts, the bank alerts, and HOA notices weren't just about accountability. They were catalysts for a deeper transformation, for both of us. The real twist? Success wasn't merely enforcing rules. It was creating the conditions where the right choices became inevitable, even voluntarily. For the first time, I could see the full picture. Lawful, ethical boundaries had not only corrected behavior, they had nurtured maturity, self-awareness, and responsibility in a way that punishment never could. Looking back, the lesson became painfully clear. My misbelief, that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries, had cost months of stress, chaos, and frustration. I thought avoidance or gentle warnings would suffice, but in reality, without clear, enforceable limits, responsibility was impossible. Derek's carelessness wasn't about defiance, it was about lacking structure. The truth I learned is simple, yet powerful. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. Accountability, when enforced ethically and lawfully, teaches lessons that nagging or anger cannot. By creating systems, documentation, and clear expectations, I didn't punish Derek, I guided him toward maturity and self-management. Another takeaway was patience. Setting up the rules, coordinating with the bank and HOA, and tracking compliance required time and persistence. Quick reactions, emotional outbursts, or inconsistent enforcement would have undermined everything. Legal, ethical, and well-documented steps ensure fairness and resilience. Finally, I realized that empowerment comes from structure. Derek learned to anticipate consequences, manage obligations, and self-correct without constant oversight. My role wasn't to control him forever. It was to provide the framework in which he could act responsibly. That's a lesson that extends far beyond a spilled laptop or savings account alerts. Here's the picture I want you to keep. A household transformed not by fear, not by anger, but by clarity, consistency, and lawful structure. The spilled water incident wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of real growth, accountability, and mutual respect. Boundaries matter. Documentation matters. Patience matters. And lawful, ethical enforcement creates change that sticks. The kitchen was quiet that evening. The same tiles, the same morning light streaming through the blinds, but the space felt different. Instead of tension lingering over the countertops, there was calm. Derek sat at the small table, focused on reconciling his own accounts, glancing occasionally at the bank alerts without frustration. I poured a glass of water, this time as a gesture of reflection, not as a reminder of past chaos. I looked at him and saw responsibility taking root. The spilled water that once symbolized frustration, lost data, and careless mistakes now felt like the first ripple in a pond that led to clarity and maturity. Our interactions were no longer dominated by irritation or defensiveness. They were grounded in understanding, respect, and lawful structure. The ledger, the contracts, the alerts, and even the HOA notifications, all of those tools had done more than protect assets. They had created an environment where growth became inevitable. Derek's voluntary accountability in moments when the system faltered was proof that the lesson had truly been internalized. It struck me that revenge, when clean, lawful, and thoughtfully applied, isn't about punishment, it's about resolution. It's about restoring balance, enforcing boundaries, and guiding behavior toward responsibility. And it works, even in everyday life, even in something as mundane as spilled water or a chaotic bank account. I placed my glass down, the water calm and still, reflecting the soft afternoon light. This image, same kitchen, same family, but transformed by clarity, lawfulness, and mutual accountability, is the one I want to leave with you. It's a reminder that even small incidents can catalyze meaningful change when approached thoughtfully and ethically. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.